Imagine standing on a muddy riverbank surrounded by dense forest, the smell of pine and salt water filling the air. And a man hands you a knife, a few glass beads, and some cloth, and tells you he just bought the island beneath your feet. That man's name was Peter Minuit. The island was Manhattan, and the year was 1626. What happened next would become the most audacious, chaotic, and surprisingly engineered urban story in human history. This is not the New York you know. This is the New York that nobody told you about, the one built from scratch, plank by plank, argument by argument, on a strip of land that nobody thought would survive its first winter. Before a single brick was laid, before a single road was paved, before the skyline existed even as a dream, there was a problem. The Dutch West India Company, a powerful trading corporation based in Amsterdam, needed a foothold in the New World. They weren't idealists, they weren't dreamers, they were businessmen, and they were looking for fur. Specifically, beaver fur, which was worth an extraordinary amount of money in Europe at the time. Hats made from beaver felt were the height of fashion, and the rivers of North America were filled with them. The company needed a trading post, a place to collect pelts, store goods, and ship profits back across the Atlantic. They sent ships, they sent settlers, and they sent a man named Peter Minuit to figure out how to make it all work. Minuit was not a romantic figure. He was a negotiator, a bureaucrat with ambition, a man who understood that the fastest way to establish a colony was not through conquest, but through commerce. When he arrived at the southern tip of Manhattan Island in the spring of 1626, he met with the Lenape people, the indigenous inhabitants who had lived on that land for thousands of years. What happened in that meeting has been debated by historians for centuries. The popular story says he bought the island for 60 guilders worth of trade goods, roughly the equivalent of $24 in later mythology. The reality was far more complicated. The Lenape did not have a concept of land ownership in the European sense. To them, they were agreeing to share the land to allow these strange, pale strangers to use it. Minuit understood something very different was happening. He took the island, and he started building. The first structure was not a house, it was a fort. Fort Amsterdam, a four-pointed, star-shaped defensive structure built on the southernmost tip of Manhattan, right where the Hudson River meets the East River. It was not an impressive sight. The walls were made of earth and logs, hastily assembled, not much more than a large wooden enclosure with a few cannons pointed toward the water. Inside there was a warehouse, a counting house for the company's accounts, a church, barely more than a large shed, and a windmill that ground grain and provided the mechanical heartbeat of the early settlement. The entire population of New Netherland at that time was fewer than 300 people, and many of them were not settlers in any permanent sense. They were employees of the Dutch West India Company, contracted workers who expected to go home eventually. Among those early settlers was a man named Jonas Bronk. Yes, the same man whose name would eventually be attached to an entire borough of the city. Bronk arrived in 1639 and purchased a large tract of land north of Manhattan across the Harlem River. He built a farmhouse, brought livestock, planted crops, and established what was essentially the first private homestead in the area that would one day become the Bronx. He was German-born. Working for the Dutch, farming land he negotiated directly from the Lenape. His story is a perfect summary of what early New York actually was. A collision of cultures, a layering of ambitions, a place where identity was always negotiated rather than given. Back on Manhattan, the settlement was growing, but not gracefully. The streets, if you could call them streets, were essentially paths that formed wherever people walked most often. There was no urban planning in the modern sense. Cows walked the same routes to pasture every morning and evening, and those paths became the first roads of Lower Manhattan. Some of those routes still exist today, embedded in the chaotic street map of downtown New York, a ghost of livestock logic preserved in asphalt. The Dutch were practical people. If a path worked, they kept it. If a fence was in the way, they built around it. The city grew the way all organic things grow, not by design, but by habit. The architecture of early New Amsterdam, as the Dutch called the settlement, was unmistakably European. The Dutch built in their own image. Narrow brick houses with stepped gable roofs faced the streets at odd angles, their facades reflecting the canal-side architecture of Amsterdam. Merchants built their homes close to the water so they could watch their ships come in. Gardens ran behind the houses, cellars stored goods and wine. Each building was a small business, a household, and a political statement all at once. The wealthier you were, the better your bricks, the taller your gable, the more prominent your position on the street. Class was written into the architecture from the very beginning. The man who did the most to shape early New Amsterdam was not a builder or an architect. He was a farmer's son turned autocrat named Peter Stuyvesant, who arrived as Director General of New Netherland in 1647 with a wooden leg, a furious temper, and an iron determination to turn this muddy, disorganized trading post into something that actually worked. Stuyvesant found a mess. Pigs roamed the streets freely. Garbage was thrown directly into the lanes. Taverns outnumbered churches. People built wherever they wanted. With no regard for their neighbors or for public space, he started issuing ordinances immediately. No more pigs on the streets, no more garbage in public areas, no more building without approval. He was not popular. He was, by many accounts, genuinely tyrannical. But he built things. One of Stuyvesant's most significant decisions was the construction of a wall. In 1653, facing the threat of potential English invasion from the north, he ordered the construction of a wooden palisade wall running across the width of Manhattan, from the Hudson River to the East River, roughly along what is now Wall Street. The wall was made of sharpened wooden stakes, approximately 12 feet high, backed by earthworks and reinforced at intervals with blockhouses. It was designed to stop an army. It never had to. The English arrived in 1664 not with an army that needed stopping, but with a fleet of warships anchored in the harbour, and a very polite letter suggesting that Stuyvesant surrender immediately. He wanted to fight. His own citizens refused. The wall had never fired a shot, and New Amsterdam became New York without a single casualty. But before that surrender, Stuyvesant had also built something more lasting than a wall. He had established the first recognizable urban infrastructure in North American history. Under his direction, the settlement got its first public well, its first regulated market, its first system of fire prevention. After a devastating fire burned a significant portion of the city in 1648, he required that all new buildings be constructed of brick rather than wood. He established the first Night Watch, a volunteer patrol that walked the streets after dark, the distant ancestor of the New York Police Department. He built roads, repaired the fort, expanded the church, and created a system of land grants that gave settlers legal ownership of their plots, something that had never been systematically done before in the colony. The waterfront was always the city's most important feature. The East River shoreline was where trade happened, where ships docked, where goods were loaded and unloaded, where fortunes were made in a single transaction and lost in the next. The Dutch were master mariners, and they understood water the way some people understand music, instinctively, viscerally, as a language of its own. They built piers extending into the river, warehouses directly at the water's edge, and a series of counting houses where merchants tallied their profits and losses by candlelight. The smells of salt water, tar, animal hides, and tobacco were inseparable from the air of the city. To live in New Amsterdam was to live in constant awareness of the Atlantic world, the ships that connected this tiny outpost to the vast mercantile network that spanned continents. There was also a darker thread running through the construction of this city. From the late 1620s onward, enslaved African people were brought to New Netherland by the Dutch West India Company. They were put to work building the infrastructure of the colony, clearing land, constructing the fort, building roads, hauling timber. Without their forced labor, the physical foundation of New York would not have been possible. This is not a footnote, it is a cornerstone. The same hands that built the Palisade Wall built the warehouses. The same labor that planted the gardens also dug the canals. New York's earliest physical form was shaped in significant part by people who received nothing in return for it, whose names were rarely recorded, and whose contribution has been systematically underwritten by the historical narrative for centuries. By the time the English took over in 1664, New Amsterdam had approximately 1,500 permanent residents. It was a small city by any measure, but it was functioning. It had streets, it had trade, it had conflict, it had culture, it had architecture, it had a slave market, it had a church and several taverns, it had a Jewish community, the first in North America, a group of Sephardic refugees who arrived in 1654 and fought for the right to stay, to own property, to trade, and to practice their faith. It had people from over a dozen different nations and language groups crammed together on a small island, doing business, arguing, building, and occasionally burning each other's property down. It was, in other words, already becoming New York. The English renamed it. They changed the laws, the flags, the official language of government. They replaced Dutch administrators with English ones. But they could not replace the bones of the city, the streets that cows had worn into the earth, the brick facades of Dutch houses still standing along the waterfront, the stepped gables catching the afternoon light, the names of places and people that Dutch settlers had pressed into the landscape like a thumb into wet clay. The Bronx, Harlem, Brooklyn from Brooklyn, the Bowery from Bowery, the Dutch word for farm. The city the English inherited was already a hybrid, already layered, already impossible to reduce to a single origin story. And that is the truth that the official histories have always struggled to tell cleanly. New York was not founded by one people, built by one vision, or shaped by one set of hands. It was assembled chaotically, violently, brilliantly from the labor and ambition and desperation of dozens of different groups, each one leaving something permanent in the stone and dirt of the island. The Lenape gave it its geography of paths and waterways. The Dutch gave it its commercial logic and its first physical form. The enslaved gave it the labor without which none of the construction would have been possible. The English gave it its political framework. And everyone who came after added another layer. The next time you walk down Wall Street, remember that you are walking along the line where a desperate man built a wooden fence to keep out an enemy that never came. The next time you cross the Bowery, remember that you are walking a Dutch farm road that has been in continuous use for nearly 400 years. The city beneath your feet is a palimpsest, a document written over and over again on the same surface, each layer pressing down into the one before it. You cannot understand what New York is today without understanding what it was at its beginning, a muddy, brilliant, brutal, extraordinary experiment in building something from nothing. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. So here's the question that should keep you up tonight. If you had to build a city from scratch, on an island, with 300 people, no running water, no electricity, and a corporation in Amsterdam telling you what to do, where would you even start?